We have the pleasure today of having Natalie Graham, Dr. Natalie Graham, with us, and she's going to be talking about her poetry and her recent book. It's Begin with the Failed Body. And of course, it's on Amazon, like everything's on Amazon nowadays. She's a native of Gainesville, Florida. She earned her Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at the University of Florida, completed her PhD in American Studies at Michigan State University, and as a University Distinguished Fellow. Her poems are appeared in several publications, and as well as some of her articles. She's a Cave Canem Fellow and Assistant Professor here at Cal State University in African American Studies. So the collection of poems won the 2016 Cave Canem Poetry Prize. And the Cave Canem was developed or promoted in early or mid-1990s, and is to promote African studies and African poets and their poems. She's also appeared on the Los Angeles Review of Books, and so you can listen to her interview there. What fascinated me with her poetry and her book is, number one, the poetry, of course, but also I'm interested in publishing, as you know, and the introduction is very unusual from what I've seen, because it really explains a lot about the poetry. And it was written by Kame Dawes, and so you'll explain a little more about how that developed. And I'm going to read just some praise from Kwame Dawes. Graham's intellectual tentacles are long, and her imagination is generous. She is constantly searching for something to pull into the body, to feed the body. Her verse is terse, marked with technical compaction, and yet it is simultaneously grandly encompassing and voracious in its interests. In her, we have a poet acutely sensitive to the ways of the body, its betrayals, its pleasures, and its unknowable selves. She is an exciting new voice, but this claim of newness seems almost trite, as there is nothing new, at least not in the sense we might apply to a novice work, about the authority, wisdom, and daring we find in these poems. So please welcome Natalie Graham.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you. Okay, so this is great. Thank you all for being here. This is like a packed house. It's awesome. I always love showing up. I've been here a couple times. There's some familiar faces that I see that we've connected with a couple times. I was just going to start with a little bit of a discussion about the background, how the book came to be, and then I'll read a few poems, maybe introduce them a little bit so you have a little more insight into the poem. And so this book, I started writing it as part of my master's thesis about 12 years ago, now more than that, probably maybe 15 years ago, while I was getting my master's at the University of Florida. And interestingly, my thesis was called The Perfect Body, right? Because I was thinking, there were a lot of religious images, and I was thinking about this idea of, like, no matter like what part of the body, there's a lot of imagery in the Bible that talks about no matter what part of the body you are, you're still, valuable. And so I had this poem about being like the armpit of Jesus, right? So it's like, that's okay with me, So that like idea of like brokenness and failure and sort of beginning wherever you are, right? That was sort of what I was thinking about in initially approaching these poems. But as I started to write, I really felt more that there was something about failure that people seem like very afraid of, right? We all want to succeed and win and be on top, and and so that idea of, but even reading a lot of the grand success stories, the grand narratives of history, you always hear like multiple failures leading up to those great successes. And so it seemed really important to sort of embrace failure and think about, so what does it mean when you sort of are a failure or you fail, and then what, right? So you start over again and you begin again, and you, even if you're kind of looked at from the outside as kind of a failed body or a failed whatever your attempt is, right? There's this natural I wanted the impulse to be to continue, to thrive, to endure. And I also thought about, because there's so much religious imagery in this text as well, it's really important to me to think about, in a lot of ways, like the spiritual or the transcendent, like begins at the end of the body, right? So sort of like you're even in dreaming, like your body has to kind of shut down before you begin to dream. And so I thought about that as sort of like a spiritual image as well. So we're so kind of terrified of our body's failure, but then there's this like transcendence or, something grander or other possibilities. So I was thinking about that too. You asked me earlier about the cover. The cover art comes from, it's fragment of a queen's face. It's from the Egyptian New Kingdom. It says the Amarna period. One of the things that I loved about this image of the queen's face also is that there was some like dispute about like which queen it was. So there's also like some mystery around that. And it seemed to me to really capture this idea of like beauty just like coming out of this like broken piece. Like there's this broken statue or fragment, and it's still so beautiful and so like arresting. And it's in the Met Museum. So it's one of this like, and when you walk through the Met, and it might be because I, picked it for my cover, but when you kind of turn the corner, it's almost like there's like light shining on it. It's like this halo, like even in the Met, it just felt like it was glowing. So I really thought it was a great image to capture, to really embody what my poems are trying to do, or at least one of the layers of what my poems are trying to do. And so I'll read a couple of those, and feel free to jump in, ask questions, make comments, whatever along the way. The first one is called Fairy Tale. And this actually came out of an assignment. And actually quite a few of the poems in this collection came out of assignments that I had while I was a master's student. I really work well out of, I think a lot of like productive creativity comes out of constriction. So the more the more limits I have on that first draft, the more I'm able to think in a way that I wouldn't otherwise think, right? And so that allows me to create maybe different ideas or different concepts, or put two things together that I would never put together in order to create an idea. And so one of the requirements was that Audrey Hepburn had to make an appearance. And I happened to love My Fair Lady. It was actually like one of the most, I watched that probably most in high school more than any other. There's like two, well, I watched Scarface too, so it was a kind of strange combination. Like Scarface and My Fair Lady. It's like, that tells a lot about my high school. And so Audrey Hepburn had to make an appearance. The word Technicolor had to make an appearance. There also had to be sort of an inside and an outside movement. And so one of the things that I really like about poetry too is just movement, the places that a poem can take you. I think that's a useful strategy to think about, like as you're writing, like being in one place and like taking the reader to another place, like in the mind, like you're here and then you're thinking of somewhere, or you're in a room and you're kind of referring to outside. Sort of that movement in the imagination, I think, is kind of a productive activity for poetry. And it's called Fairy Tale. Oh, also, I think that the phrase American epic is like a reference to Walt Whitman, right? Because we were reading Walt Whitman and thinking about like, what does it mean to write the American epic? Like, what does that mean? Like, when I wrote this maybe in 2012, what does it mean now in 2018? Like, and how are those things always shifting? Like, and who gets to tell the story of the American epic? Whose story is that? It's called Fairy Tale. While Audrey Hepburn brandishes a drooping Technicolor bouquet of violets, sagging petals sluiced with rain, capes and coats dash around the cinematic storm and dip quickly into carriages. Outside, 3 men lie crumpled in a Datsun flatbed. Eyes slits, bodies wedged between hot melons. A woman stoops, pulling her bandana, a Haitian flag, from her head. Her shadow, an uneven bruise in the sand, is pierced with stakes of light. Others pick tomatoes, lob the orangey, bulbous hearts into half-cracked barrels, bristling with splinters. There is talk of work farther north. On the abandoned set, Hepburn pretends to be a squashed cabbage leaf writing the American epic. And so that's fairy tale. So let me get some water, actually. And a lot of these poems, like Fritz mentioned, I'm born and raised in Florida, and I consider myself very Southern, even though a lot of people don't always associate Florida with Southern. If you're not in Orlando and you're not in Miami, there's a lot of South in Florida. And so this poem really is it's about my grandfather. Like there's a couple of poems, quite a few poems in here actually are kind of odes to my family. And this one is about my grandfather who was a rabbit farmer. He raised rabbits for animal testing, actually. It's kind of like a profession you don't hear too much about, right? But somebody had to raise the animals as long as the testing was to be done. And so that's one of the things that he did, right? And so it's this kind of dark, right? Because the concept is something that people aren't too excited about generally. But also a lot of it I think it also speaks to this idea of kind of making a way through, like when you live in a dark place. And I think my grandfather was very much a man who did some things that were good and some things that were bad and tried to navigate the place that he was in. It's called Raised for Testing. Gray dirt snaked under a covering of trees. The descent felt steeper, turning off the last highway in town, how the path to the old house sunk down, and dirt rose on both sides, cut with black roots. Every summer, our tan Jeep, down on a dirt snake, wound its way toward the old farmer, the icebox, the washboard, the outhouse, the tin tub, and the rabbits. Past the sagging house, through the gate, the yard opens to what should be wilderness, but is just more sky and the long rabbit house. The old farmer talks about cotton money, coal money, railroad money, and rabbit money. You only enjoy the dollar you spend, and the best dollars, rabbit dollars. The feed bag drags another snake behind us. In the rows of steel cages, hundreds of rabbits thump soundlessly, soundless except for the thumping, the rattling cages, the scratching, the cages not quite rattling but quivering. If they hissed or squealed, I don't remember their rabbit noises, just their mouths quivering and their cages almost rattling and them thumping their jumpless limbs and the machine of cages quivering and scraping together. And so, yeah, and I think that like a lot of my poetry I think could be described as sad, and there's something I think also that there's a lot of like memorial, right? Wanting to remember, wanting to recall, like, so part of the idea of begin with a failed body is also saying, what do you do when your history is sad? What do you do when the legacy, of your family is sort of a sad legacy? Do you sort of like forget it and like, don't look at it, or do you kind of investigate it and poke at it and show, okay, this was difficult, right? But this is also part of who I am, right? Every summer I was down there with the washboard, so like, it's so interesting too, to like kind of think about how it also lives, and how that, I think I want to honor that too, right? In a way, that's what a lot of the poems do. Okay, any questions so far? I know we'll probably have time at the end, and so speaking of the idea of memorial, this is a poem about my mother who's passed. But it's also after a poet named Juan Delgado, who's he's from this area. He also did a couple of workshops in the maybe like 4 or 5 years ago that I was a part of. And so one of my processes for writing poetry is going to readings and just like taking notes while the poet is reading, right? So I often like to pick up new words that I don't use very frequently that way. I always like kind of give myself puzzles to try to figure out how can I use a word naturally that I don't usually use, sort of widen the vocabulary of my poems. And also just writing specifically about a moment of listening to a poem. Because I kind of like the idea of, I mean, in a lot of my MFA, there were a lot of rules, like don't use love in a poem. Like there's too many love poems already. You can't, unless you can make it better than that, then don't use a word. Or like don't write about writing, right? Because it's kind of like the thing you're doing. You don't want to draw attention to the activity. You want readers to just be kind of be transcended, be carried away, and like almost not even know that it was a poem that was actually crafted. And so I often try to make the poetry in that process a little more transparent. It's important to me to also think about the ways that other poets heavily influence my work. So it's really important to think about, like, poetry always for me has been a community effort. Like poetry from the beginning has been something that like you learn to write through reading, right? So it's almost impossible to think about poetry as something kind of isolating and independent, even though that's a lot of the ways that we do think about poetry. And so this is The Way of the Shrine. It's after Juan Delgado, and the he is Juan Delgado. So I'm talking about being in a workshop and sort of like listening to him and what he's saying. The Way of the Shrine. The imprint of his mother's body on the hospital bed is a doorway. So vivid, then gone, he says of her memory, of her forgetting, first being a teacher, then being, then gone, an imprint. He sees them everywhere. 2 tomato slices on the almost empty plate, wobbly highlighting in a book of Psalms, the places her hands might have been. He never said her body was a doorway. He said that shadow is an imprint of the body. I don't remember my mother polishing her nails, though I was old enough to make memories. Before the wake, my aunt says, make sure her lipstick is red. I think she liked pink. I recall the smell of her face powder. I think I saw one of her fake eyelashes on the dresser with the one door broken off, and wasn't the other door half hinged, and one of the drawers inside also broken, and the brown curtains never quite shut, and the light coming through them slanting through dust, and the walls stained. We become terrain. First a body, then a shrine, then a road marker, furnishing a crowded landscape. And so that's Way of the Shrine. And so this is the first hike, and I'll just kind of read this one because I wanted to also kind of read a range of different poems. One of the things that I so appreciated Kwame's introduction to my work, one of the things that he talks about is the ways that I was really nervous about this collection kind of going in, because a lot of the collections that are doing really well right now and winning prizes are ones that are thematic. Like a lot of the poems, like even Robin Cost Lewis is like, you do the same thing, you write 100 sonnets, or you write all about this art, this type of art, or you write specifically about this relationship you had. And I envy that, like as an idea, like as a concept, but I find it very difficult. It's something that my poems kind of are wide ranging and like responding to my life, and so it's not as always like themed in those ways. So this one is about a hike. The first hike. I carry the water up the slanted, cracked path. A surprise of milky quartz, dandelions, and a hill of white clovers collapse together in memory. I consider my breath in the mountain air. She calls me romantic in a bad way. Water from the ephemeral lake may hide under the rocked soil. She clamps a husk of bark around my wrist. Her boots chomp the black oak leaves flooding the trail. Last fall's fallen leaves is redundant. She gives every scatter of rumpled things a name. Gentle Jeffrey, she points at a pine cone I'd stamped flat. Only become dominant in the worsening climate. You know, naturalists call bad soil stressful. A tornado of flies, an empty fire pit. I sit on a slab of twinkling rock, clack broken quartz in my hand like dice, huff the thin air. So that's the first hike. Let's see what I'm doing on time. Something sacred. She wakes at the first slant of day, dawn warming across the sky. She dreamt of pools of black water greasing the edge of the world. The sheet is bloody with ink. The pen threatens like an uncapped syringe to prick her. She might have slept another 50 years if this were a fairy tale. A mango, a veiny plexus in her uterus. The tumor is shaped like birth. Hospital curtains blow up like a skirt. Light opens and unfolds. A lily fluttering on white linoleum. She imagines escape by window. Later in the chapel, her wet hair hovering like a storm cloud, she will try to become something sacred. Rechristen herself something the doctors won't put their mouths on. Read a couple of the religious poems. Judas kiss. Then Satan entered Judas, and well, I'll read a couple of religious poems and then the two that I'm going to talk about. I guess maybe we'll take a break after the reading, then we can discuss. And so this starts with an epigraph of as well from the Bible. I think it's New King James, or the New International Version, actually. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12, and Judas went to the chief priests and officials of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. Luke 22, 3-5. Judas kiss. Judas was a skeptic. Blood, bread, wine, everything tasted heavy. The officials scanned the feathered scriptures. Jealousy fell on Judas like sawdust, burned his eyes, lined his tongue with wood. "Don't take yourself so seriously," the Sanhedrin said. Poverty lit on Judas's shoulder, its talons grazing the crease of his armpit. It licked the crest of his ear, singing songs to him that hadn't been written yet. One glad morning, when this life is over, I'll fly away. The officials fingered their tassels. There's no escaping hunger. Judas swallowed hard. The moon touched him with light. Night poured from his mouth.
I do have a question.
Oh, okay.
You used the word official a couple of times, and then Sanhedrin. In the copy I have, it's all Sanhedrin. Did you change during the publication? Or?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so You often, when I read this poem in particular, because everyone doesn't have the same sort of textual reference, I don't like reading like Sanhedrin over and over and over, because it's like just a word, so people don't really know what Sanhedrin means necessarily, even though it's in like that epigraph, especially if you don't have it in front of you. So I sometimes in reading I'll change some words just to clarify the meaning of the poem, and so that's one of the words that I usually change.
In print, it's Sanhedrin each time.
Yeah, I always change. I substitute officials for that, that word. That's a good question. Let's do a Magdalene poem. And so I often get, like I was doing a series about portraits of the saints, so in a lot of museums I go to, I'm always really interested in the way saints are sort of remembered and the way we've kind of imagined them in portraiture and painting. So I have quite a few in that vein, and so I'll read one from one called "The Temptation of Saint Anthony." Restorer of lost things, you resisted drowning. Turned from your reflection and Lisbon's rivers, looked west past the castle of St. George, waiting like a pup on the doorstep of God for the sun to set the sky on fire. In and out of love with everything, you held yourself tight from the appearance of spoilage. 17, impervious and water ready, you sailed for Coimbra. The streets of Alfama fell away, a dropped net. You skimmed cold avenues and leaned into holes in the ground, yearning to be burned at the stake or pierced by lions. You were an ark and the world was bankrupt. How we imagine you were tempted. An elephant trampling in tempera by the sea, a fish, gondola, or cloven hoof and gold leaf near a castle's ruins, a bare breast hanging like an open eye in the dark. I wonder, Fernando, surrounded by so much silence, might the mind whirl itself into oblivion? Might you have failed, lover of the cross, dragging yourself above the flat horizon like a dingy gull? Needed forgiveness, sinking, then rising toward heaven. And I'll read one about Magdalene. And so that's really kind of in response to a painting, and I have a couple other ones that are in response to a painting. This is one I have a couple of poems after Georges de la Tour, who does like quite a few chiaroscuro paintings, which is like really like this intersection of dark and light, which I really like in painting, and so I actually, light is a pretty common like thread throughout my collection. Like you see a lot of shadow, you see a lot of light, like light splitting corners in rooms and kind of following the light into a room. And so I like this, the painting a lot, and so I wrote in response to it. Magdalene with the Smoking Flame, Chiaroscuro reprise, after Georges de la Tour. Flat feet and round face, pinky nearly slipping into the skull's socket on the red lap. Whole life spent for a fuel that burns clean in the shrinking light. These shadowy folds and drape of skirt, that warm custard shoulder, the fussing over another candlelit Mary, the violence of private doubt. We lose so much to shadow. The eye strives to make it out. Where does the light point? Where is she leaning? The Lord is near, and yet what feels nearer? The image and fact of the image and you, Georges, the baker's son, furious with desire, tracing a rope, trailing it into shadows. Okay. And this is Black Willow. It's part of a Tanka series that I was doing. Tanka's kind of like an extended haiku. That's one way to describe it. Black willow. How the body swells with injury, floods, cankers with clots and fever, gives over its weakest parts, licks its wounds with fire. Its limbs are not arms. The willow's buds cluster, turn for sun. It weeps pitch. Its sick, black willow body shudders in the prairie wind. Cracked, gray-black bark splits from quick growth. This black willow lets down leaves too soon. Brittle limbs snap and scatter without ever splintering. The red-winged blackbird builds nests in willow branches, abandons, rebuilds, abandons, rebuilds to keep young from nursing flies with blood. The last two I'll read are two poems I wrote kind of in response to Ophelia. So Ophelia is one of those characters from literature that kind of has kind of comes up again and again, like in contemporary parlance, but also just a figure who I was just fascinated with when I first encountered, and like kind of like haunts a lot of my work, and like I really like the image. I'm sort of arrested by the image of Ophelia. And sort of the possibilities for interpreting, right? Because part of the story of Ophelia is this descent into madness. Like Hamlet is a lot about like kind of being pushed into madness, right? You're kind of, and so that concept is one that I'm always like really thinking about. And so this is Ophelia by water, and actually, we can talk about it more maybe in the second hour, but both of these poems are really also are in response to the two paintings, right? And I just printed those out so you can kind of see, like, this is a painting that I've had sort of up in my living space for probably a decade. So it's something that I'm always seeing and looking at. And so some of the references and images in the poem kind of are responding to that and talking in relationship to that. And then also the center of the water house, that's another one that I kind of think about a lot in relationship to both of these poems. And while I was writing, I was also pulling up images of Ophelia's and different. And I do a lot of, in general, that's another kind of strategy for writing that I do. Is a lot of research, I'm always really interested in kind of bringing in some historical research or some literary figure sort of back to life and giving them sort of a more human appeal or touch. And so that's part of, again, to kind of think about, one of the questions here were kind of thinking about this in two movements. My book is separated into two sections, right? And the first section really deals more with those sort of personal, regional poems, family poems, those who kind of live more in the first section. And then in the transition to the second section, it's more like icons and iconic figures, like how do we kind of reimagine them and think about them again. So the second section begins with that poem, Judas Kiss, that I read, and sort of thinking again about Judas. There's another one in here about Jesse James. Cinderella makes an appearance, and then some of the other saints. And so the book here ends with really a series of 3 Ophelia poems, but I think the middle one doesn't really register as much as an Ophelia poem because it's not really direct. It's not a direct reference. And so I'll read Ophelia by the Water and then An Element of Blank, Ophelia Reprise, which is the two that are more directly related to Ophelia. Ophelia by water. Even with the buzz and prick of summer, what thumped in her brain was not the pulse of a dark thicket, the frenetic crescendo of cicadas, but snippets of verse that sounded sacred. She turned away from noise, cooling her hymn in the current, washing a hand over her face. Lit from within, she was a candle to the cerulean shadows, perched on the edge of a black tangle of climbing vines. She waited, a doll, half wooden and half glass. Later, the sky would shiver under autumn's black hood, all pinpricked iridescent, cold air floating and ghostly currents. And so that's Ophelia by Water. And I'll read the last one, An Element of Blank. And this is also the last poem in the collection. An Element of Blank, Ophelia reprise. Her fingers twitched, brown twigs. Expect more from a body that is not yet dead. If these sheets were snow, she could have been entirely wooden. By the sink, a straight razor winked, having dark visions. Night swelled while she shrank. Everyday griefs multiplied, vines in a wretched, lush garden. In the frozen yard, leafless trees filed away. A spider hitched black insect legs to a broken net. Catching electric light, a slick leaf flickered like an erratic butterfly. Rain approached in a silent sky. Though she waited for night to whisper something tragic, she would not incline her head. And so that's the last one of the collection. And so I can talk a little bit more about, I think there were a couple of things that I wanted to mention about some of the poems maybe that I didn't read. But I think that's kind of a nice range of the different poems. I think there are lots of different ways that the book kind of addresses subjects from particular perspective. And I do think that, in the end, one of the things that I was really surprised by, so part of putting this collection together, how I actually assembled the collection was, I sort of printed out all the poems that I'd written that I felt like were done, right? So I felt like, okay, these are the poems that are done. How can I organize them? Is this something that I feel like is a manuscript, or is this just, kind of maybe two parts of a manuscript, or what? And so I went through and I tried to organize them just sort of thematically to see if there were some themes that were tying together. And one of the things that I noticed that happened again and again is you have these images of kind of things kind of frailty, right? So one of the things that I think that most of the poems sort of address in one way or another is the frailty of kind of life, the frailty of humanity, the way that we're sort of all connected in lots of ways that I think that we don't always recognize, right? And that kind of a delicate balance of those things. And also, I think that in particular, I was interested in thinking about history and sort of the resonance of history, whether it's familial history, how does my mother sort of resonate in me as I move forward into life, or how does my grandfather sort of echo in my choices in my life, but also the longer history, right? So a lot of, there are a couple of poems too that really talk about sort of the African-American experience in the South as well, and sort of thinking about living in a place that's really steeped in, the legacy of slavery. So you have Robert E. Lee Middle School, right? And so these kind of memorials of slavery and the slave past is a lot closer, I think, in sort of the landscape of the South than maybe here, obviously. And so even familial, that link, my mom sort of knowing, okay, this great grandmother, she was a slave, and then that one, she married this person. So even kind of having that as part of the family memory, sort of negotiating those legacies too. I think you see a lot in some of the poems. I didn't really read too many of those, but let me just read one because this just kind of talk a little bit about the strategy behind the poem, and this give a little background to this poem. It's called Naked in a Stormy Passage. And this is another strategy that I like to do. It's sort of a part of the found poem tradition. So essentially taking a block of text. A lot of people do this as erasure poetry, taking a block of text and then erasing certain words and then creating something new through as a process of erasure. And so that's a pretty common poetry practice. And so I thought about And so I like the idea of taking or thinking about like language and like using the words that somebody else uses to say something different. And so thinking about like, is there still something in there from them, or is it your entirely new creation, or like what sort of, I think that there's something about, there's a different relationship to the original text. And so I was interested in using that like erasure or found poem strategy to look at history, because I feel like a found poem sort of already is a historical poem. You know, it's already looking back to something that's happened before, or something that someone has already said. And so what I did was I took this passage, I took a paragraph from Malcolm Cowley and Daniel P. Mannix. There were two slave ship surgeons, right? And so a lot of accounts of, among the accounts of the Middle Passage, there are actually very few accounts of the Middle Passage, but a lot of times slave ship captains, their accounts were unreliable, right, because they had sort of a business to protect in a certain way. And so if there were accounts by captains or slave traders, a lot of times they were very unreliable. But often it would be the case that when surgeons did make some sort of marking or comment about the slave ship, it would be more reliable, and you have like more insight to what life might have been like. And so, but they're also, in reading through these, you know, I was also struck by the way that they're so, seem like they're at such a far remove, right? So you think about like when you're describing like the trauma that people might be experiencing, and the language is so clinical and so detached. So I was kind of struck by the way that the language was so clinical and detached, and sort of the way the descriptions were made. There was no sense of like sympathy or pity or understanding in their text. And I was thinking, okay, if I took just the words that they use, and so this poem is just written from words taken from the first paragraph. I tried to think about, like, there are a couple phrases here and there, but for the most part, I just like tried to think about using that first paragraph as like a dictionary. If these are the only words I knew, what poem could I write out of it? And so I try to, that's kind of like a strategy that I use for other writing too. And so that's what came out here. And I think one of the things that I noticed, among other things that come out of like a found poem exercise in writing, was the way that different images took on a different resonance when they came out of context, right? So there's a particular line in here, like 2 by 2, right? That out of context, like it takes on a whole different resonance in the poem than it did in the original text. And so I'll read Naked in a Stormy Passage. After the Middle Passage by Malcolm Cowley and Daniel P. Mannix. The skin over their elbows might be worn away. Sleep without covering. In a space between, the women wander. Right wrist to left wrist, ankle to ankle, sleep. Forced to sleep almost anywhere. The skin might be worn as a covering. To the bare bones, allowed to wander almost anywhere. 2 by 2, between decks, the women, skin worn, regarded as fair, sleep. Sleep, sailors, then another, 2 by 2, then another, then, in the space between, night and day, sleep. Soon all the slaves sleep. To the bare bones, sleep. Sleep, stormy passage, sailors, naked women, day, sleep, sleep, sleep. So that's that one.
What were the words that you picked out or lines?
Yeah, so I would say like it's so everything. So I didn't actually, usually in edits, like I'll kind of take the rules away. So that's one other kind of side note about like the practice. Like I am a big fan of like constriction, to say, okay, can you make a short story without using the letter E? It's like, okay, yes, I will, you know. And so in this one, I actually didn't take the rules away. So when I went back and edited, I didn't add anything that wasn't in the original text. So all of these words come from the original text, but essentially I like randomized them and said, okay, like how could I use these words to make something if this is all that I had all the words that I had to make. So there are very few, there's a couple phrases I know that came, like forced to sleep was a phrase from the original text. And then the skin over their elbows might be worn away is actually one of that's the only sentence, the entire sentence that I took. So that's one. And then kind of as a reprise, it changes, right? So like, and I'm thinking, the other ones, it was just like kind of cut and paste, essentially, like kind of randomizing the words and thinking about what story to tell and from whose perspective. And I was also sort of interested in the idea of multiple characters, right? I think that it's always interesting in thinking about, because I use this poem actually as a workshop too, and ask other people to write in that same way. And so one of the things that I always ask them to do is think about, okay, if one of the characters in the poem was a relative of yours, how would you write the poem? If one of the characters in the poem was your enemy, how would you write the poem? And so thinking about creating like emotional ties to the writing, without it necessarily being like overt in the text, if that's possible. So yeah. But that's essentially what I did. And so the skin was kind of worn away because it talked about planing boards, and so lying on the planing boards shackled, like the rocking of the ship would cause the skin to be worn away. And so there's a lot of like doubling too, like in the actual writing, like this idea, when you think of a lull of a ship, like the rocking of water, it's often like a positive image, right? It's a calming image, right? But like in that context, it's so, I mean, it does, I think, also speak to just the reversal of humanity that was necessary to carry out something like slavery for so long. Like you had to, be in kind of opposition to your own humanity, right? And so that's, I think, something that I noticed in the reading.
What does the 2x2 phrase mean?
I was talking about them walking down. They're shackled together. So, and typically, one of the things that they were saying too is that often that women would be unshackled and allowed to kind of walk around the ship, right? But they're also kind of prey for the sailors. And so that being, again, that sort of limited freedom became like danger, right? So it's like the freedom to do what? Freedom to be exposed to another sort of violence. And so, yeah, that was referring to a shackling.
But the 2x2 also has a reference in my mind anyway of Noah's Ark.
Absolutely, yeah. And so that's something that even in like bringing that back, I was thinking about that doubling, right? So you have like 2x2, and so also like the ship, like the kind of lull of a ship, which is sort of why there's a lot of repetition in the poem to sort of echo that lull and think about like, I mean, it's almost, to me, what I wanted to do is kind of outline or focus in on a little bit the horror and the humanity of these moments. And so recalling this idea of like, Noah is like this moment, this image, right, of like, humanity being saved through a ship, right? And this is sort of like, not the opposite, but like this idea of like humanity being sort of destroyed, in these moments. So yeah, I did intentionally think of that. Yeah.
Natalie, you mentioned that there is a concept in poetry where someone would take a poem and erase words out. Mm-hmm. When did that concept come into poetry?
Oh, that's such a good question. I don't even know. As long as I think that I came into know about found poetry in about at least 10 years ago. And so I'm thinking erasure poetry is probably about, as old, maybe longer. I'm not sure the exact date, but it's certainly something that I've seen a lot of in a lot of collections.
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
In the 60s, Robert Rauschenberg, who is an American painter, took a drawing by de Kooning, who is also an American painter, and erased it. And didn't quite erase it all. That is, you can see a shadow of what it was.
Yeah.
And that's hanging in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I'm wondering whether or not that concept came out of the visual arts into poetry.
Yeah, that's good. That would be worth looking up. I'm not sure. Yeah.
To erase your paint.
Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I think there's a lot of crossover in that way.
Oh, yeah.
Natalie, can you tell us what found poetry is again? I know you did a class with us here.
Yeah, so found poetry is essentially using text from a different source. I mean, just starting with a different source. And so a lot of poets do it in very different ways. They might, I think erasure poetry is probably the most common. Like there's a couple that were published in pretty, some of the top tier, I can't remember if it was Poetry Journal or like Kenyon Review, but recently with all of the like the My Too movement and like the public apologies of like of men, like some of the, I think a poet took 3 different apology letters and sort of erased particular words and highlighted other words to sort of turn it into something else. So found poem is just essentially taking a text, taking language from a different origin, and using that as a starting point for a new poem. Often erasure poetry, often like even equally common, there's like a journal of found poetry. Equally common is taking like a block of text and just adding line breaks. Right? And so it's not even like erasing particular things, but it's just like using the line break, using the space on the page to make it mean something else. That's pretty common, I think. Yeah.
I just had a thought. If I'm taking someone else's poem and erasing or adding words, am I violating some copyright rules? Someone struck me that, wait a minute, how can I do that?
It's a good question. Yeah. I mean, it's.
Fun.
I mean, typically it's like it's an attribution. You know, so you would think like even so. Another example, similar example would be the cento, right? So that goes back at least 100 years, right? And so this idea that a cento is just taking one line from a poet and putting it together, you know? So a lot of times people would do it and say, okay, I'm gonna do a cento in, in honor of, Dante's Inferno or whatever. And so I'll take a line, and I'll make 100 lines and I'll kind of chop them together to show how beautiful each line is, like even out of the original context. So in some cases, I think people would argue that it's sort of like paying homage to, right? But it certainly would be the case that would need to be attributed. Say this is the original source, it's an after this poet or something like that. I think would be it would be necessary. And it adds to the meaning of the poem and what it does, because part of what you're talking about is that conversation between the two.
Natalie, how do you spell that?
Cento, C-E-N-T-O.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what you did on this. You actually gave credit
Yes.
to Crowley or Cowley.
Mm-hmm.
And man.
Yeah.
Well, it's fantastic that you came and took the time to be with us today.
Of course,
We
my
really
pleasure.
appreciate it. She has a couple more books if you're interested.